All right. Hey, everybody. This is Jason Herbert. And here it is. This is the Historians of the Movies podcast. This is something we've been working on now for about 4.5 years, building this Historians of the Movies community, this thing that we have come together for every weekend to talk movies and talk history, but really about creating a community of people online. And this is the next most natural progression, and we've worked really hard on it. I can't thank all of you for your support as we start to listen into this. Huge thanks early on to everyone who has chimed in to give your support. You guys have been inspiring to me. Huge thank you early on to Fletcher Powell, our producer, who is making all this happen. My buddy Jason Bush, who is helping me figure out what this website and everything else that goes along with this. And every single other person that's come along, that's done these podcasts, that has tuned in for the last 4.5 years, that has guest hosted HATM. This is yours. This belongs to all of us. So we're working really hard on this. It's going to change. I'll tell you guys the same thing I told you 4.5 years ago. Keep the bar low. You'll never be disappointed. So this is our very first podcast we're doing. We got Black Panther coming up, as well as Chef. We'll be releasing on the same day. And like this, subscribe to it. We're going to make it available on every platform we can. This belongs to all of us. So check it out. And without further ado, here comes the very first Historians of the Movies podcast. I hope you dig it.
This idea that there could have been a different path from the moment that you have European contact with the west coast of Africa and with the exploration of the Western Hemisphere, that is tremendously seductive and powerful for people.
What can a Marvel superhero movie tell us about history, the past, and where we go as a society in the future? We'll find out when we talk Black Panther next on Historians of the Movies podcast. And welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. I'm your host, Jason Herbert, creator of Historians of the Movies. Allegedly the longest running watch party on the internet? I don't really know. We're making things up as we go along here, but I'm a historian and you pretty much have to take what I say as gospel. So thank you all so much for being here today. Today, I want to introduce all of you to one of my great friends, someone that Twitter has given me this friendship of, and a dude that I have learned so much from in the last few years. And I'm talking about Walter Greason. He is among the most prominent historians, educators, and urbanists in the United States. He spent the past 30 years speaking to audiences in dozens of states on over 100 college and high school campuses, dozens of professional and academic conferences, and the community groups across the country. And you can find him every single day, as I do. You can learn from this guy every single day on Twitter. You can find him at Walter D. Greason. And you can find his books. He's written 6 of them. His 2 most recent books are Industrial Segregation and Cities Imagined, the African Diaspora in Media and History. And I just can't wait to get into this today. Walter, dude, I am so happy you were here when I was thinking about who I wanted to have as the first guest on HATM podcast. Man, you were the only person I could think of because you've meant so much to me, so much to my scholarship, the ways I think about things. And dude, I just want to get into this. So thank you so much for being here today.
Jason, it's a joy to be here with you. Thank you so much. Historians at the Movies is one of the most amazing creations I've seen on the internet. Doing this work now since 2007. And so I'm just thrilled that we've made this connection, and I consider you one of my best friends that I've met through this platform. I cannot wait for the day we get to meet in person.
I know, man. Me too. I'm just glad it's not tonight because apparently you were just saying earlier before we start rolling, it's like cold and snowing up there, which it is, not down here in Florida. But I mean, it's so I don't. God. So how long have you been? See, you're at McAllister, which is in St. Paul,
Yes.
Correct? Right. So how long have you been up there now? How many years?
Just one, a little bit over a year.
Had you spent much time up there before, like geographically?
No, I had been up here for one conference maybe a decade ago. And so coming out of New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey, it's just completely different. But I find that the community, as insular as some folks find Minnesotans to be, The group of immigrants and folks who have come from other places is extraordinary here. And so the diversity and the commitment to a kind of progressive political agenda is so amazing. And so I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, like any other city, like that whole area is like definitely not without its own, its own problems and stuff like that. Stuff that's obviously trying to overcome. But like, I really enjoyed my 2 years up there when I was doing coursework up at Minnesota. Like, and I think the state itself is really gorgeous. I mean, it's really quick and easy to get outside the cities, and you can do whatever. And if you like museums and stuff between Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's just an otherworldly amount of stuff. And like you were saying, the diversity of the city is like, man, the food in those towns, like I consider it like one town. Like the food is ridiculous there. Tell me what you do, like as far as your work that you're doing up there at McAllister. So, we're talking a little bit about African diaspora and stuff like that. Read off your books. So, talk to me a little bit about like how you come into your particular specialty as far as your field goes, because we're all like, I talk to all these other historians, and we all have like this own backstory of like how you got into whatever, right? I do the field I study is nowhere near where I grew up or anything like that. And everyone's got their own like story of how they came to do what they do. So I'm hoping maybe you could kind of introduce us to that before we get into the film.
Yeah, certainly. So this is a very weird, twisty, turny. Everybody who comes through a doctoral program and then starts to think about where they want to land and hope to teach and how their career develops. It's unusual. You take a lot of different roads and paths, and you can never really predict how it lands. But for me, I was did my undergrad and my graduate work in Philadelphia, Villanova for undergrad, and then my PhD at Temple University. And my undergrad work was very much broad introduction to world history, working with Magan Keita, who is an medieval Africa historian, which was very weird when he had started his career and I was working with him. And so thankfully now we have a lot of scholars who have taken on ways of looking at medieval world and bringing Africa back into the story that was constructed about through professional history. So, but his foundation connected me to philosophy, connected me to literary studies, did a lot of work in diplomacy and how to negotiate really difficult situations, and of course, Africana studies. And so those fields intersected in my graduate work where I was basically introduced to urban history as the primary lens of what my doctoral work focused on, especially after my parents were in a car accident. And I had planned to go and study in South Africa and compare it to the experience of the United States, particularly about racial violence. And my parents' accident made me focus on a topic closer to home, which ended up being suburbanization. And so the first 15 years of my career, like 7 years of doctoral study plus another 8 years on the tenure track, were all the absence of study of suburbs in American history. And so, building on Ken Jackson's work, combining it with Robin Kelly's work, and really focusing on the displacement and destruction of Black communities nationwide was really my main topic. And Suburban Erasure won an award. A lot of my oral history work turned into photographic history and Path to Freedom. And so that was what I became known for up until about 2010. And along the path, my students introduced me to Facebook. And in getting involved on social media, I found it was a good tool to build academic community. And then in 2012, my mother had a real severe turn in her health. And so I moved back to New Jersey and left Pennsylvania and got a job at Monmouth University, which is right down the road from where I grew up and had been a place where I did a lot of study as a young person. In fact, all of my doctoral studies started really at Monmouth to build this history of suburban New Jersey. But in coming there, they asked me to teach economic history. And so this was something that was peripheral to what I did in researching suburbs. I had to understand real estate finance in order to tell the story of displacement. And so, in doing that work and restructuring it and making it more quantitative, I actually did work at Columbia University and Barnard College for about 3 years with a group of researchers, finding out why our GDP was no longer a good measure of economic development. And I ended up publishing 4 books out of that during my time at Monmouth, where we were really reinventing how to understand economic change in historical context. And that has been an amazing experience, even though I was at a smaller institution. That then led to me being promoted to a dean of honor school. I built a doctoral program while I was at Monmouth for educational leadership in higher ed. And all of those combined experiences then led me to get this job as a department chair at Macalester, which is a small liberal arts college, but amazing, unique connection to a global community where the main institution on campus academically is the Kofi Annan Institute for Global Citizenship. So Kofi Annan is by far the most prominent alum of Macalester. And so his legacy then animates a sense of how to bring people together from every country on earth on that campus. So we get students from over 100 countries from every state, and the kind of discussions about diplomacy and resolving conflict and building a stronger world community are just a daily part of what we do. So to be the chair of the history department there is amazing by itself. Doing a lot of work around decolonization, around indigenous sovereignty, which of course lends into so much of the work that you do. But then this past September, they named me the DeWitt Wallace Professor of History, which is the highest honor they can bestow on a scholar at the campus. So I'm still kind of overwhelmed and a little confused that this has happened. But a lot of that comes from my work as a digital historian, and particularly the success of my Twitter platform. That
Yeah.
being able to connect and build a lot of communities through Twitter. I think my last really big thread hit like a million direct users and some ridiculous like 4 billion, direct like uses over the course of like 3 or 4 days. So, at a little liberal arts college to be able to share content in a really dynamic way, that's kind of been the hallmark of my career. And so I'm doing a lot of stuff now with VR and AR and doing historic preservation work to reverse the things that caused me to study suburbs, is to come up with ways to restore Black and Indigenous communities around the world.
Obviously, I came to know you through Twitter, and you were always like one of these guys. When I saw, I was like, "Wow, look how he's communicating." And it's and we've had these conversations before about how I just feel like as scholars, yeah, I mean, right now Twitter's a hot mess and all this kind of stuff, but yeah, so be it. I feel like if I write a book and 6 people read it, nothing changes. And I feel like the ability of Twitter, the instantaneous, the reach that it allows is something that I feel like so many people outside or in academia, scholars, historians, professors, whomever, of whatever, right, are really missing the boat on this. I just feel like you have this amazing ability, like you just said, to literally reach thousands, millions of people with a single well-placed thread, right? That ordinarily would never come to any one of any number of books that you might read and thoughts put together, right? This is an important tool I think people should be utilizing.
Man, I'll tell you, my primary function in higher ed was as a teacher. Like I did not come into higher education thinking about the scholarship and the research I would do. It was like, how do I teach the best information to the largest number of people, given the limited time I have? And in 2008, a student of mine in a hip hop class, I gave an assignment to produce a kind of short film, multimedia slideshow about hip hop and how it shapes activism. And this student, who was a struggling student, was about to fail out of school, built this amazing short video about a Nas song. What is it? Rule, with a singer called Amory. And in space of about a week after, they all had to post their videos on YouTube. Good videos in that class reached, 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 people. This student's video reached 250,000 people in its first
Good
week.
Lord.
And I was like, oh, I will never sell that many books. I need to figure out how I get more of this kind of good content out to more people. And that video still is one of it's an amazing compilation piece. I think it's over 600,000 now, and it's still by far the most impactful student project that somebody's done in one of my classes. Since then, just following that example, building communities of thousands of scholars on Facebook, having them produce extraordinary work, I would say, probably at the top of my head, out of my racial violence syllabus, which reached a lot of folks. But more importantly, it inspired both Ibram Kendi and Nicole Hannah Jones to do their books, How to Be an Anti-Racist and 1619 Project. And so, to see how really important digital work can then drive both scholarly and popular discourse. I agree. People are seriously missing the boat, especially unnamed presidents of professional societies that want us to go back and just say, just do your solo monograph. That's all you need to do. This misses what's possible for all of us as scholars and historians.
Do we want to name said unnamed president of unnamed society? Because I'm considering going to said unnamed society's annual conference in January. And there's been a lot of pushback. Like, I'm not going to go because of said unnamed president, and I'm just like, that's exactly why I want to go. I want to hi,
Oh
you're
no, I'll be
wrong.
there. I will be there. So that will be
Are
where
you
we
going to
can
go?
hang out. Yes.
Yeah, it's not like you don't know Philadelphia. I was literally thinking, I got to reach out to you anyway. I was like, if I'm going to go, oh, well, that's good. So, all right, we'll talk about this huge thing that reaches people that can teach it, that teaches a lot of history. The whole point of talking about tonight was this film Black Panther, and of course we'll talk a little bit about Wakanda Forever as well. Maybe do some hot takes or some immediate takes, because we've both seen the film. You've seen it twice now. I saw it once on opening night, and this would have been about a little less than a week ago. And we both have some different thoughts on the film. But we'll start off and talk about Black Panther, because it's this gigantic film, right? It made like $1.3 billion at the box office. I don't want to lay too much out here, because you know far more about this film. You've written about it. You've talked about it far more than I do. So I'll just kind of sit back here and go, yeah. I guess maybe let's talk a little bit about Black Panther. Just your initial thoughts, because I think sometimes it turns people's heads when I say, "Oh, this is a movie you can learn a lot of history from," and they're like, "It's a Marvel film. It's a movie set. What's this vibranium? Everybody's flying around on spaceships, and why do we love Black Panther as a history film?"
My goodness. So the opening scene is a narration about the way world history has evolved in the last 500 years. So, yeah, its entire premise is about the importance of history and alternative paths.
The Wakandans used vibranium to develop technology more advanced than any other nation. But as Wakanda thrived, the world around it descended further into chaos. To keep vibranium safe, the Wakandans vowed to hide in plain sight, keeping the truth of their power from the outside world.
And so I guess that's one place to start, is this idea of contingency, which is a huge factor in how we understand change over time, and actually have some humility about the surviving evidence and how we can interpret it, which is enormously important. So that opening scene frames a story that then moves into the 1980s, early 1990s in Oakland, California, and again situates it in a way to understand the legacy of the Black Panther Party, which is not accidental, which is at the heart of how the director, how he grew up in Oakland. And so this way of historicizing the moment and the place and the people, all of it is historically informed. And that's not accidental. That was a big part of how they started the conversation about telling the story. And so every place that they go in that film serves a purpose to then shape the way that an alternative view of history could be constructed. And that's one of the debates that I constantly have. Since the film, that's been the most popular topic people ask me to come and talk about, is what is the Black Panther? Why does this resonate? And so the richness and the texture of the production serves one purpose: to attract audiences and hold their attention. It's absolutely gorgeous. The costuming, the set design, it's a brilliant, brilliant arrangement right down to the music. Like those were the things that the film won the Oscar
Oh my
for.
gosh.
And it does not win the
Mhm.
Oscar just because it has an all black cast. Like it had to be extraordinary craft. There are tons of all black productions that happen every year. None of them. And everybody who saw that movie had never seen anything like it before. And so that's part of it. Its uniqueness, the depth and the range by which it was composed in basically every facet of the story. And so within that, the comic book piece is it's not in the top 10 of what they were actually trying to build there. Like they use the source material to shape what kind of story they can tell to introduce the character and to move the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe story forward. But Black Panther was about so much more than just what happens with a Marvel movie. I'll say very frankly, in the run up to it, probably from about October or November of 2017, the excitement just was, oh, there's a black superhero.
Yeah.
And as audiences just got excited for the possibility of that, they came in and got this entire world and sense of how we didn't have to live with the trappings of racism and sexism, xenophobia in the same ways that had kind of dominated a world shaped by Western influence. It was like, man, there was something different here. And so, this idea that there could have been a different path from the moment that you have European contact with the west coast of Africa and with the exploration of the Western Hemisphere, that is tremendously seductive and powerful for people who have grown up in a kind of multicultural world, who want to see the possibility of an egalitarian society worldwide. How could it actually look and operate? And so the film taps into that optimism. And that's what begins to change. That's why people couldn't stop going to see it.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started rolling, right? There was this sense I pick up on, and we'll talk we'll talk about this when we compare Wakanda Forever. But it was like, for me, there was this very real sense of joy just this entire time that I'm watching this film. Like this is a celebration of Africa, of the African diaspora, and it's really, to me, I felt like, we're talking about this is a black film, right? It's made by black filmmakers. It's largely black, largely black cast. I am, I'm a guy from Kentucky. My ancestry is English, and I felt like this film was also for me, right? This was a film for everyone to enjoy, and I think that was part of the idea, was that the celebration is like, I think that's part of the reason why it resonated well with so many people, and obviously, we definitely needed an African American superhero. I mean, and Chadwick Boseman, my gosh, he was the he was one of those guys, when people talk about when a celebrity passed, who about, man, it just felt like we lost this guy. And I remember we ended up doing Black Panther a second time on HATM right after he passed. And I remember wondering, is this okay? Should we show it? Whatever. Cause it was just like, this movie just like felt like it was for everybody, to me at least.
Yes.
And I could watch it. I think I've seen the film, I don't know, 10, maybe 15 times, because it's incredibly rewatchable. It has maybe our best villain in any Marvel film. Killmonger is terrific, and he's this, I still have a hard time calling him a villain, because I just, and that's what makes him so good, is that you understand this hate and this anger and his motivations. He's not just hey, I want to kill the whole world or whatever. He's got some very real reasons for the things he's doing, and you could see why T'Challa could go that way, right?
Yes.
And there's an argument that says that he kind of ultimately does come across a lot of Killmonger's thinking towards the end, but in a different fashion. But the scene with Killmonger when he goes into the museum and he's taking the things back. I mean, that is just this movie and the sequel have so much to say about colonialism, about the violence done onto African descent peoples, and it pulls no punches on that. And I think people don't go into superhero films thinking about that.
No. You imagine the way Marvel constructed itself, and they dealt with politics kind of as a subtext a lot. So even like the Iron Man movies are about the military industrial complex and kind of the compromises involved there. I mean, you can't do a Captain America story without, there was World War II, and then it's framed by issues of the Cold War when you get to the Winter Soldier. It's framed by, frankly, issues of the Civil War in Captain America Civil War. These themes are all there when you have the historian's lens to look at these stories, but they are never as forcefully articulated where you cannot ignore them until you get to the Black Panther story. And so you can always kind of provide the veneer of the action adventure story in some of these other films. But when you get to a story about an African country living in isolation and believing that the world was just not ready to participate in what they had to offer, the colonialism piece, it's actually my one big criticism that I wrote about for Black Panther is that Ulysses Claw should not die in that story. Like Claw is in the comics the embodiment of European colonialism. And so to have him just killed by Killmonger en route to kind of advancing this particular story, it misses out on an enormously valuable piece about what was valuable about the Black Panther kind of comic stories. And so I know that's going to come back around. They're going to do it very differently as they move into the secret invasion story. But I still lament that in that first film, they couldn't find a way to make Claw evolve because he's a really unique villain for that particular set of stories.
Yeah, he's fantastic. I mean, and I think we're all starting to come to terms with the fact that Andy Serkis is a generational talent himself. Anyone who's been watching him on Andor has been just blown away. And just and the things he was doing well before that. I mean, I'm going to be the biggest Andy Serkis guy anyway. And, the thing with this film is that Coogler really assembled just the best possible talent. I mean, I think we have to consider Coogler on a short list of best filmmakers working right now. I don't know anybody else who could have pulled this film off to handle all of the digital efforts and the action sequences and the set pieces and I don't know anyone else who could have pulled this film off.
No, the sequel, Wakanda Forever, to me is a crowning achievement for him. I mean, from Fruitvale Station to kind of how he's evolved now.
Mm.
I said this publicly online. It's he's the best director in cinema today, and whatever project you want to do, he can take that on and make it happen. So I'm excited for where his trajectory is. It's similar to how I felt about Chadwick Boseman. I'm still not over the loss of Boseman as an actor, given the way his career had begun. I think a lot about someone like Denzel Washington, and if we never got to see any of his work after The Mighty Quinn, it would have been just an inestimable loss. You can't make up for it. And I love a lot of the actors. I'll say Jonathan Majors is kind of climbing the ladder right now to kind of fill in, but we could have had both of them.
Yeah, and Michael B. Jordan is great. I'm a big fan of his. I thought he was just amazing in Black Panther because this was us seeing him in a different role, especially coming out of Creed, which I have seen so many times. I think Creed and Creed 2 are phenomenal. I'm rooting for Creed 3 to be good. Jonathan Majors is going to be in there, of course. And then Jordan himself has taken over the director's role in that. And he's completely, Stallone's not going to be in the film at all. So this is entirely his role. And I love him in this role. But, go back to him in Black Panther. He's one of the reasons why that thing works so well. Is it's just chock full of amazing performers. I wanted to ask you about this term I saw. I had never seen these words before this film came out, and saw you using a lot of these words. Saw a lot of these words flying around. And one of the things I really like to do as a historian is admit my own ignorance, right? And just say, I didn't know about this, or this, because it's true. And this film got me thinking about a lot of different stuff. So Afrofuturism. When people talk about Afrofuturism in the context of this film, what do they mean?
So really simple from a historian's perspective, and anyone who's been trained as a historian in the last 50 years is aware of what I'm about to say, is that 100 years ago, 1920, The concept of Black history, and then specifically African history or African diaspora history, was completely fictional. There was no place for that discussion in a professional context, and it's decades of struggle, led by Carter Woodson and W.B. Du Bois and any number of other professional scholars that were just kept out of the profession because they were Black and because they studied Black people. And so you don't get any even gesture to bring African Americans into the profession until the late 1950s, early 1960s. And then there's still a huge burden of proof on them to demonstrate that they can be professional historians, that they can be part of the inquiry and bring new bodies of evidence to the table. And to me, it's almost a miracle that between 1965 and the Civil Rights Act, and then, Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, and then 30 years later, a little over a generation, there's generally acceptance. And there's a generation of scholars who have blazed the trails to make a more inclusive profession. And so Black history was fiction for most of the 20th century.
I know this to be the case, but it's so hard to understand how that could be, and it says so much about the time and the era, right?
Yes, indeed. And it's at the moment when those trails are being blazed that people begin to notice in science fiction that why are all the characters and all the stories are about white people? Like, is there anyone else in the future? Are there indigenous people? Like, are there people who speak different languages? Or is this really just a British colonial project that's extended out for centuries and millennia going forward? And so Nichelle Nichols on Star Trek starts some of this, but then it grows with Samuel Delany and then with Octavia Butler. And so it's really in literature that you start to see this argument being made through fiction that there are futures for peoples of the African diaspora. And they're really interesting and they are compelling and they need to be developed and expanded. And so it's in the mid 1990s when Butler's literature starts to take off and become more widely read. And so as that happens, you have, frankly, folks like me and Alondra Nelson and probably less than 100 writers and artists who are starting to take seriously the idea that there are fictional futures of Black people, artistic futures of Black people that can be developed and understood in more clear ways. And it's actually at Columbia where Mark Derry is, during the course of an interview, says, well, what is this aesthetic where we project people of the African diaspora into the future? Is this a kind of Afrofuturism? Is literally the first publication of that word. And a decade later, more than that, 15 years later, maybe 75 of us get together at Princeton after the killing of Michael Brown and at an event that Ruha Benjamin hosted called Ferguson is the Future. And there had been a series of conferences hosted by John Jennings and Ronaldo Anderson called Astro Blackness and Planet Deep South. And these things were all about, this is the turn that's coming. We're at a critical mass. We're doing this work in different ways. And it was literally 2016 that Black Panther appears in Captain America Civil War. And that's when I published the Wakanda syllabus. All of us knew the wave was coming. And we didn't know how big it was going to be, but we knew the infrastructure was there to carry it forward. And so just like in the 1920s, this group of Harlem Renaissance, Chicago Renaissance, LA Renaissance authors and writers and artists came together and began to articulate the value of African diaspora culture and the importance of Africa in world history. Now you have this time when there are hundreds and now millions of us talking about Afrofuturism as the aesthetic vanguard, as the ones who open up the door for the entire world to not be constrained by European sensibility. And so there are antecedents, there are Afrofuturist flashes in previous generations, but as a organization, as a way that people are building a movement. It's much more coherent. It is articulating standards. I have a series of new methodology books coming out next year about doing this work in a way that is legible for the academy. And so there's just a way that the platform has gotten larger and has been affirmed publicly, and it has become undeniable, coming out of the traditions of experimental jazz with Sun Ra, with George Clinton and the funk traditions. These are all flashes of Afrofuturism that you're seeing. Earth, Wind, and Fire in the kind of soul movement draws on a lot of this imagery and this kind of sound. Stevie Wonder does this work. But then it evolves. It turns into Missy Elliott and Busta Rhymes and Outkast through the kind of core of the hip hop years. And so Afrofuturism has been with us a very long time, but its articulation in the mid 90s, and frankly, the folks who are doing it now and doing it like professionally refer to it as the Black speculative arts movement, is that there is a way of the Black imagination, the Black intellect, projecting out a different kind of future than what we would inherit from kind of this British American, Western European, North American structure. And that's what's a great thing about the new film, is that it takes our premise for how we design a place like Wakanda as an imaginary place, and it extends that to Talokan as an indigenous underwater empire. And so that's taken what was a Central African, East African expression, Pan-African expression, and turned it into a globally indigenous expression of what kind of society could exist away from European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. And so it's so inspirational. When I did a museum exhibit about Afrofuturism called Afrofuturist Design in 2019, the last piece of that exhibit was about the need for indigenous futures, indigenous design. And so to see this again come to fore in this film 3 years later, it's just very exciting. We're at the brink of doing some extraordinary work in this century.
All right, you've got me wanting to go off in like 14 different directions now. So I'm like literally scribbling notes over here on my right hand while also trying to like make sure my beard does not get too warm over here on my left. For those who can't see, like Walter was laughing at me earlier on because he started talking. I just like had this just big stein right in front of me, which I didn't warn him about. Okay, I got a couple questions for you actually, because I do want to ask you about the Wakanda syllabus. Definitely want to come back to that. But talking about the speculative arts movement, how does this moment in time with music? Because I hadn't even thought about Afrofuturism in regards to like Stevie Wonder or Earth, Wind, and Fire. Even though I'm like literally singing, 21st Night of September the other day, right? I'm that guy when I'm cooking, but I hadn't even thought about that. It's like part of Afrofuturism, and I'm sitting here going, "Oh my gosh, that's so cool." How does this compare? How does this like moment in time, like right now where we're sitting in 2022, compare to say something like the Harlem Renaissance or something like that? Is it comparative at all, or is it something completely different? Am I off? I mean,
No, it's so much larger. It is so much larger than what was possible with the cultural Renaissance movements of the 1920s, because they were still largely carried out within systems of Jim Crow segregation. There was only so much that was possible. We're living in a world well after the time of Barack Obama as a president, when we have Kamala Harris as a vice president. And in last week's elections, we had huge numbers of people of color and young people and women seizing political authority on a scale that was unimaginable a decade ago. And so, yeah, there is just a capacity for us to really shape the world in a way that leans into liberation. Not to say that there aren't obstacles and barriers and people who will fight tooth and nail to stop that kind of work, but we're stronger than we've ever been. And so that's what to me is amazing about this. Ronaldo Anderson is a dear colleague. He and I have done a lot of work together. And he's at Temple University now, I believe, running their graduate program. but he was just in Cameroon organizing a Black speculative arts convention. He is routinely crisscrossing the continent, going into South America, organizing in Canada. Hip hop made the step towards Afrofuturism deeply, profoundly global. That there are people all over the world who will hear what comes through these kinds of artistic and scholarly expressions and then tailor them. If you look at what happens in Ukraine, a lot of the ways that these guys articulate and define themselves, they have stylistically pieces of hip hop about how they are defiant, how they reject authority, how they will be celebrating the ways that they overthrow this aggressor that's hitting them from Russia. I saw this meme about the vision of Ukrainian liberty standing on the carcass of a bear, and it was straight up just like that's a badass expression, but like it comes out of all these ways of saying that we rule ourselves and we decide for ourselves how we will express and communicate and connect and build communities that value and affirm ourselves. And so this sense of self-determination that you can look back to, whether it's the Woodrow Wilson side of trying to kind of adapt and evolve European empire, or it's the Marcus Garvey side about kind of Pan-African Black nationalist expression. These things are all moving towards local autonomy and human dignity. And so there's an enormous opportunity right now, and I talk about this in the counter-convergence thread I put on Twitter, is that people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin also see an opportunity to really stomp on the idea of freedom right now. But I think we outnumber them. And frankly, they're not terribly smart or creative. So I believe in our ability to succeed long beyond your lifetime or mine.
Well, I'm tell you what, I'm just excited because I was about to show you, I literally wrote down the name Marcus Garvey like 15 seconds before you said it, and I'm just over here high fiving myself now. I was like, oh, I learned a thing. I did. I mean, good for me. And did you see the news about the film about him coming out?
Yes, I do know the film is coming. Yes, indeed.
With a Black Panther relation, right? I think Winston Duke is supposed to be.
Winston Duke as the lead role, which don't get me started talking about M'Baku. Like, if there is one thing that first movie did in rehabilitating that character, holy crap, that was miraculous.
Well, we need to get there because I'm becoming the biggest Winston Duke fan. I think that dude is an incredibly charming actor. I felt like he's not in Wakanda Forever a bunch because that movie Wakanda Forever has 1,000 actors in it. But every time Duke is on screen, you are just mesmerized. And this isn't just the Black Panther films. He's great in everything.
Yes.
Like I am just becoming a big believer in that. And I haven't seen everything he's done, but every time I see him, I'm like, this dude's good.
So much charisma. It's amazing.
All right, talk to me about the Wakanda syllabus. You said that you published it first in 2016, and we might be able to transition this a little bit to kind of talk about how Wakanda Forever will change that if it does at all. I don't know, but can you talk to us about what the Wakanda syllabus is and what it does, and like how do we use it?
So the Wakanda syllabus is a compilation. It's essentially a multimedia bibliography of if you want to create Afrofuturist media or scholarship. It is a one-stop shop where you can build out all the things that you didn't know existed and then find ways to use them in new ways. It took 7 years to pull everything together. So as a hobby, when I was going through my doctoral program, a guy named Christopher.
You had time for a hobby when you were doing your doctoral program?
A few, sadly. Like it was non-sleeping, and so break away from just reading
mine
the
was
books.
questioning my life choices.
No, man. What is it? Joe Quesada was the editor-in-chief at Marvel at the start of the 2000s. And he hired Christopher Priest for a thing called the Marvel Knights series, where they were doing Moon Knight stories, they were doing Daredevil stories. It was all these guys who were kind of on the fringes, beating up people in alleys, creating trouble, kind of like Batman for Marvel. And in the midst of that, they relaunched Black Panther. And I will never be more thankful, because the Black Panther of the 70s and 80s was this guy. He had kind of a ratty costume. He was always getting jumped by gorillas or rhinos and getting stomped out and bleeding and half naked trying to win fights. And it was very much Tarzan stuff that I was just like, oh, can we do something
Where's
else?
the super in that superhero?
Oh man, it was crazy. It was like he barely survived all his adventures, and it was supposed to feel good that he lived through to the end. And I just couldn't deal. I could not deal.
Right.
So Priest started telling these stories. It was wild. The first 6 issues of his Marvel Knights run was bound as a trade paperback called The Client, and it's told from the perspective of Everett Ross as a State Department liaison who is sent to pick up this African king, and he's never heard of Wakanda before. So he shows up in a Miata to pick up this king of this country. And he pulls up to the airport, and the Black Panther is there with like a 45-person entourage and like
Right.
mountains of baggage. It's all like sight gags tied to this kind of political intrigue that the Black Panther is coming to the United States because there's a problem. Something is happening in Brooklyn that he needs to figure out so he can get back to his country and straighten everything out. Amazing story. One of the best comics ever written, ever drawn. Still friends with the artist who produced the comic. And so I saw this story and I started writing to Priest, and I was like, just emailing him. It was like, you have done everything. He had reinvented the Black Panther as a Shaft character, that essentially he was telling a blaxploitation story, and ends up, the end of the story is all of these problems are essentially being caused by Marvel's version of the devil, that the Black Panther has to confront Mephistopheles to like deal with this crime that's been committed. So instead of this kind of like street level story, all of a sudden it becomes this cosmic confrontation, and the Black Panther wins. Like no one had ever done a story where the Black Panther confronted Mephisto, and certainly not would come out victorious in such a situation. And so he reinvented him with a much more dynamic suit, painted him as a king, as the king and the religious figure at the core of his society. He was like, this is not someone to be trifled with.
Right.
And so he invested a dignity in the character. And so I started talking with him about the religious implications of how he had told that story. I really started talking with him about, well, now that you've made this a more serious character, you have to do that for the society he comes from. Like, you have to flesh out what Wakanda is. And for me, it was a lot about the Wakandan economy and this notion of how does vibranium work as a commodity. And so I want to say about 6 months later, after we started that conversation, they literally named the company that like represents Wakanda on the world markets. The name of the company is the Wakanda Design Group. So it's literally, its stock ticker is WDG. And so that was their little nod to me being this, contributor, but off camera, about kind of complicating the idea of Wakanda. And so that evolved over a few years. When Reggie Hudlin took it over, I would start talking with him because he wanted to make it more cinematic. And on Reggie's website, we literally built like all the elements of, if you tell a Black Panther story in a movie, this is what you need to have in it. This is how you need to understand the entire cosmology, the history, the sociology of the society. Like, we went through category by category and built out not just the framework, but also potential stories that would not repeat the errors of the past. And so it was amazing. Like, all the Marvel authors would come by the site and like pick up pieces of stories that they would then use. And so so I started talking to Priest in like 2001. We started really writing everything up in 03. By 07, 08, we had put everything together on Hudlin's website. And then, we just kind of waited. We saw in 08 that the Iron Man movie debuted, and we were like, okay, maybe one day we'll get a Black Panther movie. And then by 2016, when he showed up, we were like, okay, put it all together, make sure everybody sees it. And that was the Wakanda syllabus. And so we revised it in 2017. The movie hit in 2018. I published a book, Cities Imagined, about designing Wakanda as an urban environment. So, like, before anybody saw what Wakanda was on screen, we had it in the text. Like, this is what you're looking at. This is how you can understand a different kind of place in fiction. And we contrasted it with Gotham City. So it worked really well. But then we revised the syllabus again after the movie came out. So that was like 2019. And then since then, we've just been teaching and lecturing about it, everywhere, all around the world. And now, we're at the point, like, we just got one new book out just now called The Human and Superhuman. And it's about the Wakanda Design Group, is the chapter I wrote for that book. There'll be another book out on the history of all the kind of different elements of Wakanda that'll be out in the spring. And so this work continues to evolve both in popular culture and in the scholarship. And it's just been the most amazing experience.
I'm wondering, you've obviously taught with this at this point in time, and you teach Black Panther. Have you noticed, was there a pushback against this idea of Afrofuturism, this idea of like T'Challa as equal? You see him on screen very much equal to Captain America and like the big guns, right, of Thor and Hulk, and he's right there. And even that scene in Endgame, you don't get a sense of like the good guys have got a shot until Chadwick Boseman walks out, right? And you're like, this was actually, he was like the missing piece of the gang, right? Because it was like you had Thor and Iron Man. It was like, but this other dude, like this was the other equal to these guys, right? And there was like, oh, he's got this great scene where he's running and blah blah blah. But I'm wondering, have you noticed, has there been any kind of pushback that you've noticed as a historian for people that don't want to accept T'Challa and Black Panther as an equal to these other characters? You're smiling at me right now. I'm like, maybe this part where we kind of have to complicate the story and say like, not everybody, I don't know. What's been your experience? Because I'm like, yeah, this guy's awesome. But I mean, what have you noticed so far as far as the way people react to Black Panther?
So that's been an ongoing conversation among comic book fans for generations. So there's always a friendship between Captain America and the Black Panther. That Priest does amazing work kind of fleshing out that Captain America actually first came to Wakanda when T'Challa's father he tried to bring T'Challa's father into World War II. And it was really controversial that like Captain America is coming and he's got some other soldiers with him and he's essentially going to negotiate this alliance. And T'Chaka shows up and just knocks him out. And it's just like, how are you coming up on my doorstep? I did not invite you here. And so like there's a scene with T'Chaka after he knocks out Steve Rogers that he's carrying him on his shoulder back into the palace. And it was like, oh, how? No, what? And so they have played with this idea of who's stronger, who's faster, who's the better fighter between T'Challa and Steve Rogers for a long time. And inevitably in Marvel, because whoever's book it is, that's who wins. And it's almost always Captain America's book. So the one I remember was a fight where they had where Steve Rogers says, well, I know you're too noble to fight dirty, so I'm going to cheat because this is too important. And so he ends up knocking T'Challa out, ostensibly fighting dirty. And it's just like, no. And so there are these like little rhetorical literary tricks that the writers try to pull. But Priest also had Iron Man go head to head with T'Challa. And like there's an amazing line he wrote where one of T'Challa's advisors says to him, he's like, Tony Stark, do you ever realize that T'Challa could build whatever suit of armor he would want, but he chooses not to? Do you understand the wisdom in this? And it was really just this thing. And this is the defining character, is that he has such capacity that it's important not to provoke the kind of resistance that comes when you are ostentatious about your ability. And so, like, there's just an entirely different framework psychologically and philosophically about how the character evolves. And the most pronounced example of this will actually come out in the next couple of years in the movies, is that there's a group called the Illuminati that now they've made it into the MCU. And they invite T'Challa to be a part of this kind of secret group of heroes who essentially come together to prevent large-scale problems. And he's like, no, just our existence will create those problems. So this is foolhardy. Stop it now before it gets out of control. And of course they don't, and it leads to all kinds of other really terrible problems. But like that's always what T'Challa is about kind of unlimited human capacity, very carefully tempered with kind of wisdom and humility. If we can get that kind of story across in the next couple of years, man, that's a victory. But the main thing that's come about now, it's become consensus because of T'Challa's upgrades that like in a head-to-head fight, Batman can't really defeat him, and so that's like this kind of comic nerd discussion is that Bruce Wayne's very tough. He's not going to beat T'Challa. Like that, there's just no way
He's
to
not
get
superhuman.
So the fight becomes, can T'Challa really stand up and fight against Thor? And so that's really this discussion about kind of Asgard versus Wakanda. And so there's all kinds of like, well, Thor is the Nordic pinnacle, and therefore, he has to always win. And that still doesn't really get addressed. That's the piece where it's just like the European mythology must always reign supreme.
Well, I want to actually talk for a second then actually about this other character we mentioned earlier when I was man crushing on Winston Duke over here, because you had said about what these films are doing for M'Baku. So, question: what are these films doing for M'Baku? We're going to spoil Wakanda Forever. If you haven't seen this by the time this comes out, which will be in December, shame on you. Talk to me about Winston Duke and M'Baku and why he's important in this whole sphere, and also like what does he represent?
Yeah, so very important to place in historical context that for most of the last 2 centuries, if not more, certainly since Thomas Jefferson wrote Notes on Virginia, there's been this barely concealed contempt among European writers for African people and African civilization that treated them as simian, as monkeys and apes, and this was a regular slur that was used against people of African descent. Jefferson has this kind of line that he throws away is, of course, the African prefers potential sexual contact with the European, much as the ape prefers contact with the African and the African woman during their native stage in Central Africa. And it's just like, you're saying that African women are having sex with apes and this is a natural course of events. Like, come on. And so M'Baku in the comics is not even really called M'Baku. He is called the man ape. And he is dressed in a large white gorilla costume. And he is literally a joke outside of Wakanda. Like, he is this man who pretends to the throne and he hopes to conquer the country, but he's always getting beaten. And when particularly he shows up in the United States to try and track T'Challa down and create a problem, he's a clown. He is literally ridiculed in the pages of the comics as someone who doesn't belong, is kind of dumb, and stumbles around and just ridiculous looking. And again, Priest did a miraculous job of just making religion taken seriously in the Black Panther comic books. So M'Baku was never, again, about kind of physical contact with or contests with T'Challa. It was that he is the head of a rival cult within the country that believes geopolitically that the country is being governed incorrectly. And he has a massive political intrigue to find an heir to the Jabari's cultural role in Wakandan society that he then uses to mobilize geopolitical forces and like a rebellion, a civil war within Wakanda. He makes him a serious religious and political figure, but still has to dress him in the white gorilla costume. He gives it some deeper meaning, but it's still a white gorilla costume. So you can't really get past that. Winston Duke coming into the Black Panther movie, that scene at the waterfall where he walks out of the tunnel and his people are cheering for him.
Oh yeah.
Immediately, much more serious dynamic about who that character is. And they take there's no gorilla costume.
M'Baku, what are you doing here?
It's challenge day.
We have watched and listen from the mountains. We have watched with disgust as your technological advancements have been overseen by a child who scoffs at tradition. And now you want to hand the nation over to this prince who could not keep his own father safe. We will not have it. I said we will not have
And a subtle throwaway line that a lot of people didn't even pick up the first few times they saw it was when T'Challa says to him, I accept your challenge, M'Baku. He replies,
Glory to Hanuman.
Glory to Hanuman. And Duke's delivery is perfect. Like Hanuman is a monkey god in Western India. And it just speaks to an African diaspora that is completely unexplored in the Western world, that there's this connection between India and East Africa. Unbelievably clever, thoughtful, subtle, just amazing, and perfectly delivered by Winston Duke.
I had no idea. And like I'm sitting here thinking, of course, right? Because historically, like the Western idea of Africa was that it was the dark continent, right? This place where folks are stationary. And of course, right? Of course, people were exploring well beyond their homeland, their territories, well beyond the continent, right? So when you say that, it makes so much sense.
And so Winston Duke goes from that point forward. You know, it could have been a very easy throwaway character for Ryan Coogler, but they make him central in that he is the one who rescues T'Challa and allows him to kind of be restored as Black Panther. And this then forms an alliance that makes the entire country stronger. I think probably the least discussed major consequence of that first movie is the partnership between the two ethnic groups within the society that had been divided for thousands of years. And it's because of Winston Duke's charisma. Like as an actor, for him to stand and be alongside Chadwick Boseman, not just in the Black Panther movie, also in the Infinity War, also in the Endgame movie, at the climactic scene when T'Challa shows up and the armies all come out of the portals and they charge at Thanos, right in the middle of the screen is Winston Duke as M'Baku. And I was like, there's no possible way that could ever happen. But like, because of him as a performer, they made that character indelibly etched into the lore that has been in that cinematic universe. And that carries through in this sequel in Wakanda Forever. He becomes enormously important to how the plot evolves. And his closing scene where he returns to this moment at the waterfall and is like, it is challenge day. I just love it.
I love the challenge day bit, right? Because it was playful. But I got to tell you, the thing that I felt was his representation in Wakanda Forever. He seemed like so much of a wiser man. Maybe, I don't know that, like maybe the events on screen had affected him or what, but he comes back as this incredibly poised dude that's like, this is how we're going to protect our people, and we shall offer, refuge to anyone who wants to come back into the mountains, right? He was very much a much more cautious guy than we'd seen, and he seemed really kind of be this voice of reason there that was really kind of offering this very real interjection and talking about, hey, these are the thoughts that you guys had in the last film. Look where that got us.
There's a scene where he speaks to Shuri right after her mother's death and is talking about it's where you talk about there's this request about how to keep the people safe, given that the capital's been flooded. And she's confused and just like, why would you come here? And he says, I promised your brother that I would be your protector and guide. Man, again, not bombastic. Like his relationship, both as a character to the other character, but as an actor to this actress that he's worked with, the layers of how they convey these really kind of gentle but essential moments of the way the community stands together as family are just brilliant. And again, without the quality of his skill as a performer, it would come off poorly. Instead, it's powerful.
It just felt like so much. Like even there, it's almost like he's saying to Letitia, right? I promised Chadwick I would be here too,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, it just feels that way. I listened to another podcast. I think it was The Big Picture, where they were talking about how shortly thereafter, the very beginning of the film, after Chadwick Boseman, after the had died, Angela Bassett walks out there, and you're like, is she crying because she's giving this scene, and there's no way you're not thinking about the death of your friend. So much of that felt layered in, and I made we talked immediately afterwards. I was like, man, part of this was really hard for me to watch.
Yeah.
Just because you felt that and I, like we were saying earlier, I don't know that I'll ever be able to watch Wakanda Forever as often as I can. I think I'll study Wakanda Forever.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I can watch Black Panther. I can just watch and enjoy it. Like, this is fun to watch. Wakanda Forever has a story, has something it's trying to teach me here, but that's more of I need to watch and pay attention. And for me, it was not as an enjoyable film, so much of a popcorn kind of big picture kind of thing, so much as a deliberative thought on grief and absence. And there were some misses in this film as well. And I guess maybe we're kind of transitioning into Wakanda Forever. I thought there were some real hits in here too. We've got the introduction now of Talokan instead of Atlantis, which I loved. The introduction of Tenochtitlan as Namor. I think everybody loves this guy as Namor. Namor has traditionally been
Khan. Only his enemies call him El Nino Sin Amor.
well. Then Kul Khan, because I have no beef with that dude.
Oh no, no one any problems.
So I love what Marvel did with this. Love what they did with the Atlanta storyline. The comic book character Namor, I remember growing up in the 80s reading comic books going, I don't know if I like this guy or not. I don't really think that he seems to be kind of a jerk.
Yep.
This film, I don't feel like he's a direct translation of the Namor I saw on page in the 80s. He's got a lot more heart to him. He seems to be less self-obsessed. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because obviously this is a huge aspect to this. Is what I loved about this film. Was like I was like, okay, cool. Now we're kind of gonna take for the Mayan history, Mayan civilization, and kind of bring this into the Marvel universe, and largely to global audiences who have not seen this on screen. I think maybe the last thing they'd kind of seen on this was like was it Apocalypto or something like that. Was really the closest thing, right? Which has its own issues,
Yes.
right? What are your thoughts on, say, the introduction of Kulkulkan and Talokan into Wakanda Forever?
Just gorgeous. Just gorgeous. I think it's a way that this film may again win an Oscar for Hannah Beachler for set design. She put up a picture just recently about the throne that they actually made. It was not a CGI setting. And so there's just deep genius at work with the way Hannah Beachler works. And I am always amazed to see how she puts her work together. So on this particular character, Namor in the comics is clearly, and I just will say, he's an asshole. Like, he is about himself, and he has enormous power to back himself, to back him up in any particular scenario. I was introduced to him in Avengers comics, where he was kind of involved in a friendly rivalry with Hercules, and so there's always this kind of tension about these big burly men and having like who's really stronger kinds of conversations. And so for me, then when that evolved again with Priest, and he brought Magneto, Doctor Doom, and Namor together to confront T'Challa. And just that premise that you're getting these three kind of iconic figures of Marvel Comics together to come and deal with the Black Panther and feel like, oh, we've got to counsel him to be more reasonable. Like, you don't get that in the previous generation. And so
those three guys, awesome.
Over time, the comics evolved where there is a really bitter relationship between T'Challa and Namor. And it's really because Doom lays an ambush and nearly kills T'Challa, which was, again, part of the original way that they were thinking about this movie. Shuri was going to become the Black Panther. even under the original script, and T'Challa was going to be incapacitated, if not dead. And so that was going to come from the comics. And within that structure, as there's a perceived vulnerability during Shuri's rule, Namor floods all of Wakanda. And so I was going into this movie when I saw the scenes of the flooding of the Crown Room. I was like, oh, they're going to destroy the entire country just the way they did in the comic. And so Namor's power, I think, comes across, but again, they kind of restrain it to kind of keep it in context for later stories. But man, I was so happy to see the way they developed it. And even his ankle wings, which can look a little silly, were tolerable within this story. That was one of those moments where I was like, yeah, he doesn't need those to fly, but I get it. I get it. He tribute to the character.
Yeah, you kind of have to do the ankle wings because otherwise it's like it's not real to the character. And at this point in time with the Marvel films, it's like we're talking about Dude to Fly, the Quantum Zone, all stuff. Suspension of disbelief. It's a comic book series, right? It's like we're gonna see him do stuff. It's like, yeah, I get it, right? I also felt like, there were I saw some people kind of complaining like, oh, it's and the comparisons are obviously people are going to make it to the Aquaman series as far as the way that those two kingdoms are shown underwater. I actually like this way more. I felt like it was darker. It was harder to see, and it should be that far underneath the ocean, right? It felt cold.
Yeah.
Like I felt cold watching it. So the production design on this was just, I loved it. The mind influence, of course, absolutely. Like the origin story of Namor, how he comes to be was fascinating. Were there parts of this film that like didn't hit for you? What didn't work for you in this? In
So
Wakanda
one
Forever?
quick note more on the cinematography about Talokan.
Oh yeah.
I loved what someone pointed out to me in the first movie, the first screening I saw, that then I just loved it in the second, is that the people of Talokan outside of the water appear blue, but underwater in the depth, they appear brown. And so like the complexion of kind of the way the society worked, I was just like
I hadn't even thought about that.
it was spectacular.
Somebody was complaining about that on Twitter today. Oh, everybody's blue. I'm like, well, in what? Okay, wow, yeah,
It was wild. And so, yes,
yeah.
there are pieces of this film that don't work for me. But again, we mentioned this a little bit earlier that in watching it the first time, I was very much studying it. And there's so much to take in about the craft of it as a project that, I was really just getting used to it. And so the second time I watched it twice in less than 12 hours, which was a mistake.
It's a lot of Black Panther. The movie's 2 hours and 41 minutes. It's a long film.
It's the emotional weight that got me. And I'll what I'm about to say, but for the record, this is the first time I've said this with a recorder rolling. My father passed away in mid-September. And so I'm still deep in kind of coping with his loss, which is, I'm not over my mother's death from 2 years ago. And so, this kind of compounded sense of loss in my life is especially sharp right now. And to go into this film where I'm already feeling terrible about Chadwick Boseman, who I never met, and then have these deep senses of personal loss already unresolved in me, and then seeing a film that's about an epic tragedy, I am completely overwhelmed and trying to that's why I was supposed to see it a third time 2 nights ago. And I was like, yeah, that's not a smart decision. Things that don't work for me within that frame, once I understood, like the first time I saw it, I was like, this is way too heavy. This is way too slow. People are not going to get this. This is not going to connect with the audiences the way the first film did. In watching it the second time, I realized it was almost like a love letter to a lost brother. And, Ryan Coogler has said in interviews he doesn't intend to continue doing, Black Panther or Marvel stories. And so it's almost like a goodbye letter to people who loved what he did with this. And so to me, it's an astonishing accomplishment kind of to close off his vision of what he did, but also to bring people into his own feelings of loss. It works in a way that it's not about really the conventions and structure of the film. And I know for a fact that the cast was deployed after the opening night to start to counter some of the ways that audiences were receiving it. Winston Duke has been very active on social media to try and play up M'Baku's role in kind of lightening the scenes. A lot of the production staff have come out to kind of talk about the work that they did to make the film what it was. But they're all kind of apologies for taking their pain and rendering it so viscerally for a global audience, because it is not something people will run back to and watch over and over again for years. But I will say, on the other side of that, what I experienced, given my own personal pain, is that there was some healing and recovery for me in sharing it with other people. And so I think over time, may not be for 2 or 3 or 5 years, but as people come back to it at difficult moments, to know they're not alone with their pain, I think the film is enormously useful that way. But again, that's not something that very often you go to films for. Like, I can think of films in the 80s that were made with this kind of aesthetic towards pathos, where it is designed to make you sad and struggle with your sadness as you watch it. But that's not common anymore. I don't see as many, especially big budget movies, really structured around sadness. That is not how we expect to go in and see a Marvel movie. But that was a lot of the Phase 4 too. I think of Multiverse of Madness is about Scarlet Witch and the loss of her children.
Sure.
The Eternals and kind of the revelation of, what their existence is all about, and trying to find their own freedom. Even Moon Knight, coping as a Disney Plus series, is coping with multiple personality disorder, which, is just not a joking matter. Like, you can make it a little lighter as you deal with a superhero character, but there was just a lot of pain through this last phase of Marvel. And I think it's reflective of what they did fictionally with Endgame, is that, yes, we get half of all life restored, and we give up somebody like Robert Downey Jr. / Tony Stark in that context. But, I think it also reflected a lot about the world and things like the Trump administration and Brexit, and just the absolute sense of horror at the rise of authoritarianism, and coping with the pain of COVID. There's just so much suffering that we've experienced as a world, as a civilization, that the film taps into that through the lens of Chadwick Boseman's loss, and by extension, the loss of T'Challa. And I'll say that is my number one thing that I came to after seeing it twice, that I dislike. I was not a recast T'Challa person, which is kind of the hashtag online. I knew the character T'Challa was going to be injured, if not dead, by the end of the second film. I also am very confident that there will be not just a new young T'Challa, his son, but a new version of T'Challa that comes into play in the next couple of years, because the nature of the story that they're telling kind of requires that character. And so
Right.
I'm very comfortable, but at the same time, it made me realize, this is my main complaint. It made me realize, as spectacular as Chadwick Boseman is and was, his death is not equivalent to the death of a fictional character like T'Challa, that has a very specific and unique role in a fictional serial literature. I tried to think about it like, if you killed Bruce Wayne and really made it, you get no more stories with Bruce Wayne. If you kill Sherlock Holmes and there are no more Sherlock Holmes stories, like, both of them have had thousands, decades of fictional exploration. To me, to take away T'Challa removes the chance of this important fictional character that has a really unique role in the Marvel structure, just as the character was kind of becoming, just as it was flourishing. And so, tragic to lose Chadwick Boseman, but to then kill the T'Challa son of King T'Chaka character, to me, that I will feel more and more over time that that's inexcusable.
I think that Coogler had an impossible task here with this film, which is how do you move forward after losing Chadwick Boseman? Obviously, the powers that be in Marvel, there's way too much money. Marvel's ultimately in business to make money, and Black Panther films really make a lot of money, largely because of Coogler, right? Because Coogler has done this work and assembled these stories and shepherded this. He can't give it up, and especially in this time, there was no way you could leave this to someone else after losing your friend in Chadwick Boseman. As I'm watching this film, about the death of this superhero, I lost my grandfather about a year and a half ago, and he was in my life superhuman, right? 87 years old when he passes. And for me, I was to this day the 4-year-old boy bouncing on his knee. If anything, it was almost for me like, yeah, death comes for us all. Even your superheroes will die, right? And then how do you deal with that legacy and that grief? I wasn't a recast T'Challa guy either, but I also kind of felt like that wasn't really for me to like have a voice in, as weird as that might sound. I was like, I know, I said earlier these are global pictures, and they're definitely for me and for anybody who wants to go watch them, but they mean different things for different folks. And just watching the process of this grief, and my favorite thing about this film was actually the stinger. The stinger was like the moment of joy for me for this movie. Everything, like, I don't think we've ever seen a stinger nail. I mean, there have been some good stingers, but that nailed the landing in any far and away. And it was frankly my favorite 8 minutes of the entire film was that last bit. And can we talk about how Haiti is presented in this film? Because that was the thing that I absolutely loved.
Yes.
Loved Haiti in this film. Because I thought Lupita Nyong'o was amazing in this. I've never seen her better on screen. I'm a big fan of hers. My big complaint was we didn't see her enough because she was mesmerizing every instant she was on screen.
Yeah, no, she is one of the great stars of this generation, and really any generation in Hollywood. And so, yeah, I wish they had made more of her time. She plays significant roles largely through the kind of middle to second half of the film. And really coming out of the first one, she was the core solution from the beginning to this problem that Kilmonger presents about how do you engage, but you do it responsibly, thoughtfully, and based on circumstance. And no one appreciated that. They're like, oh, it's T'Challa or Killmonger. It's like, no, it's Nakia. Look over there. And so her piece of kind of choosing Haiti as a site for her child to grow and for this new generation to rise is just, to me, it's perfect. It was extraordinary. The larger questions where, like, so for Riri Williams as the scientist, that's clearly in service to later movies. They're doing this across all of the Marvel projects, that there has to be a kind of teenager.
I felt that was distracting.
Yeah. It took away and was not essential. I see a lot of attacks on the dynamic with Everett Ross and his girlfriend, ex-wife Val. People wanted that excised from the film, and I was like, yeah, but you need to set up Thunderbolts, and so, as well as Secret Invasion, and so it could have been a cut scene, could have been an end scene, I guess, but like that was why that was there.
So that was my thought here, right? It's like I feel like Marvel's in this rut where they feel like they've got to make every film and it's got to be bigger than the last one. And this film, with Shang-Chi. Shang-Chi was a really good movie till they got to the last third, and the final ending. I think we've all talked about was just trash. And this film, I thought the more interesting thing to do would have been to make this a smaller movie, a self-contained film, a drama with some action rather than a superhero action film. And I love Martin Freeman. We know Thunderbolts is coming. We know Riri Williams is getting her own show. I just felt like these were less important things when we're trying to deal with this grief here. Everett Ross, absolutely, because he does bring a little humor to it, and we definitely needed some humor in this film. But I felt the movie was like 35, maybe 40 minutes too long, and I felt like if we'd excised that and just made a smaller, had been a more compact film dealing with the grief, I don't need to know that there's another Marvel movie coming. I live in this world. I know there's a Marvel movie coming. I don't need. If you remember, you talked a little bit about Iron Man back in 2008. We got one reference to more coming on, and that was in the Stinger. That
Yep.
was it. We didn't need to spend 2 hours setting up the next thing. I just wanted to sit and be in the moment in this one. And I thought that's what actually made Black Panther work so well. It was a Black Panther movie. It wasn't like setting up to be into the next whatever. It was like, we got the one little thing with the White Wolf at the very end in like the second Stinger. So
Yeah.
those are those were really my big beefs. Was like, I just wanted more. I wanted less, so we'd have more.
Yeah.
If that makes any
I
sense.
I get you.
All right.
No, for me, it's the epic scale. I was willing to deal with it. If I got to deal with 3 hours of whatever, Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, Return of the King, I can deal with 240 of this Wakanda story.
All right. Well, let me bring this back then about history itself. And we talked a little bit about African diaspora. We talked a little bit about other films and things like that. Can you give me some examples of books that really got you into your work? And then maybe some other films that, like, about the African diaspora, you think people might really kind of dig into that, that you find that are really cool, in this moment here in 2022. They don't have to be the best thing, but just stuff that you're into.
Wow. So I am a huge Octavia Butler fan, and the Parable books, Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, as fiction. Certainly, if you want to know who I am, I felt completely seen by Octavia Butler in those 2 books. But the world really in Parable of the Sower got to see what it looks like when you have a Christian nationalist that comes to dominate your society. And so, yeah, the 2 Parable books by Octavia Butler are just essential if you want to understand Afrofuturism and broadly to get a better grip on the world, as we hope it does not become in this century. Just spectacular. She died way too early, and I only met her once. And the book that she signed for me was Parable of the Talents, the sequel in the first edition. And it was lost in a home disaster, and I will never recover from not having that book. But just the story itself is so spectacular. And that's always my first recommendation is Octavia Butler generally, but those 2 books in particular. And then I would go from there to, I would say I got Sophia Noble's book in my head, Algorithms of Oppression. It's talking about digital media and the way it is being used to reinforce really bad colonial habits and mindsets. So I've taught that book twice now, and students find it amazing to come to grips with the things we talk about through social media and the capacity of it to grow things, but also the dangers that it presents to us. Let me see. Saidiya Hartman. Everybody likes Scenes of Subjection, but for me, it's Wayward Lives is a later book that she did that I just find extraordinary for the way it blends fiction and nonfiction and brings historical processes to life in a way I really haven't seen from any other writer. So, yeah, Saidiya Hartman, Sophia Noble, Octavia Butler. It's hard for me to go wrong with those 3, but there are so many amazing authors out there. Of course, for me, I will say my new book that's about to drop is called Illmatic Consequences, written with Danian Jerry. It's a collection of essays about the what we call the clapback to critical race theory, opponents of critical race theory. So we talk about what critical race theory is. We talk about the kind of autopsy on the propaganda that was used to attack it. And then the last section is all solutions for communities and for schools that want to actually promote inclusiveness and equity. So that'll be out early in the spring. So you can pre-order now.
What do you got for me for a film? What do you got?
Yeah, my life has been swallowed by Wakanda, so I'm going to say that up front. But I've actually been watching, I think there's a film, I'm going to mess up the title. It's a Viggo Mortensen film, came out last year. It's Future Crimes of Humanity or Future Crimes Against Humanity. I forget. Crimes of the Future. That's what it's called.
Oh.
It's got a very independent feel, but man, that is a movie that's an experience to watch.
And you were just talking crap about Lord of the Rings. How dare you, sir?
That's
Aragorn.
Lord of the Rings is an amazing series. I like it better than the Hobbit trilogy, but like, come on, like the overall undertones about race and ethnicity.
It's a lot.
Even as I saw it, I was like, I can't love this, but so much.
That's fair.
And I grew up with like Gandalf was like the first kind of epic literature that I read, and so like I'm invested, but I was like, we got to come to a better place. we can't just keep producing this kind of story.
Did you watch the new series on Amazon Prime, The Rings of Power?
Rings of Power. I've seen a couple episodes, and I also have to watch the Game of Thrones prequel. It's, was it
There's so much stuff right now.
something for the dragon? I forget.
House of the
of the
Dragon.
Dragon. Yeah.
House of the Dragon, Food for the Dragon, whatever. Dragon gets divorced. Dragon goes to middle age. Dragon goes to counseling. HBO's going to be like selling this stuff for years. We're going to be living through this stuff.
I think of House of the Dragon because another Afrofuturist writer is working on it. That's Nnedi Okorafor. She's another amazing writer.
Well, there's this big thing about changing race from the books into the film, which I think actually worked really well with the Sea Snake, and he's really, really good.
Yes,
I watched the series. I guess it concluded about a month ago or whatever. I remember watching it and liking it. I'm not as into it as I was the original Game of Thrones, but I think I'm Game of Thrones out after everything. But I'm back. My life is about Andor right now.
Yeah, I mean they wrapped that up really poorly. Like
a little bit. They kind of did not stick the landing. All right. Well, let me try to see if I can't wrap this up. So and not do a poor job of it. I want to bring this back to Black Panther. Here's our big thought here. It's Black Panther a history movie.
Oh yes. Oh my goodness. And so is Wakanda Forever.
I can't not talk about these films in history classes for a long time. I mean, there's just too much they've got to say.
Your particular genius, and I've said this to you in other conversations, is that our profession needs to grow to take more seriously how it engages with media content. And you have done that so brilliantly with Historians at the Movies. And till I die, beyond my death, I will tell people over and over and over again how indebted we are to you for bringing this to us.
Well, thank you. It's hard for me to hear that and blush, but I'm going to go ahead and leave instructions to Fletcher, the producer, to lead with that on every episode from here on out. And actually, I'm going to call my mom now. She's like, I don't understand. I try to get her, she's like, mom's like, I don't even watch TV. I'm like, I know. So whatever. So,
believe me, man.
I cannot thank you enough for being here and being part of this HATM community. Where can people find you online? We said it a little bit earlier. Where if people want to get a hold of you or find you,
I did want to say I changed my Twitter handle. Although I'm dealing with some issues, so like I'm not checking as often as I did normally. But Walter D. Greason, Greason. That's my Twitter piece. But that's also my website is walterdgrayson.com, and you can always catch me there on Instagram as well.
Well, I don't have a fancy name. It's just Herbert History.
That's spectacular.
It works. My dad gave me the last name part. The history just works well. So, Walter, thank you so very, very much. Thank you to everybody who joined in tonight and listened to us talk about these movies that we just absolutely love. Thanks to our editor, producer, the guy behind the curtain, Fletcher Powell. And if anybody wants to find HATM, you can find us at historiansatthemovies.com or on Twitter with the hashtag HATM. And that's it. Talk to y'all later.